So, welcome everyone to the next discussion, which will be how to make an RP international power blocks. We're going to be looking at a wide range of things today, from what is an international power block, types of power block and what they entail, why do these blocks come to power in the first place, what kind of build-up you need to effectively create these blocks in an RP setting, how much does it take to manage and run one of these blocks, how to create it without ruining the overall setting narrative, how to RP interplay and conflict between nations within a power block, as well as power blocks on a large scale, what not to do when creating a block, and example of power blocks IRL and in character as well. So, to start with, what is an international power block? Well, an international power block is a collection of nations which have, through collective diplomacy, aligned their interests and motives. Power blocks can literally be like an alliance of the nations themselves that have equal pull, or they can actually be unbalanced affairs in general. Some may be multilateral, where different nations pursue a common goal, while some may be unilateral, where nations pursue a specific agenda in the most sort of efficient way possible. Some can also be separate entities, with the actual power block itself having its own independent framework of government and passing actions to whichever nations want to work within it. They can both be extremely extensive and in-depth, or quite loose with little in the way of regulations. The power blocks themselves actually allow and offer large set pieces in settings which cannot easily be filled with, say, just one regular nation, and also provide possible points of contention or conflict which are great for an overall sort of main story. They also allow players to band together and become much more interconnected story-wise, whether for, defense or other purposes, than just individuals, casually doing things themselves. So, what are the types of power blocks and what do they each entail? So, there are obviously countless different sort of, types of power blocks and endless context for why they are created. I'm just going to go over the sort of basic tropes that I have found in most, RP settings and sci-fi in general. Remember that sort of, alliances and power blocks, however, can be combinations of these, and they can often incorporate different focuses into one broad umbrella. So the first one is obviously the, really bread and butter one that you find everywhere, and that's military alliances. They're the most common in an RP sense, and extremely common just in settings in general. They often revolve around some kind of pact that focuses militarily between the different nations and their capabilities. This may be a focus on joint defence, where one is attacked, the others have to come to their defence, like NATO, or it might be more of an elaborate alliance, where nations jointly undertake actions as part of an integrated uniform military. Some military pacts might even emphasise just sort of loose joint exercises, or be more watchful and built around containing a particular foe or threat, designed to increase cooperation between the states that, dislike that threat or foe, and that are actively aligned against it. So, they're often created in times of convenience, so like warfare or tumultuous sort of ongoing matters at the time, or between extremely close allies in times of peace, or in relation to most things. So, most states won't, however, get involved in another's military matters, even if they're very close. So if you are going to do a military power block, you've got to really sort of, flesh it out in detail. So, military alliances in RP are quite simple affairs, and so, sometimes they're just a case of, joint defence, or, allowing member states to act far more powerful than their individual capabilities in either offence or deterrence. And as said, you'll kind of find them everywhere. It's the usual, everyone turns up that are sort of aligned against a particular foe. They agree to work together, they agree for joint defence, and all of a sudden that foe cannot fight one of them and take them apart piecemeal, or the others will get involved. The second sort of, I guess, really common trope that you'll find amongst power blocks is economic pacts or alliances. So they're much more relaxed and focused, as the name suggests, around state economic matters. This includes stuff like preferential trade treatments between members, lower to no tariffs between members in exporting and importing goods, unified currency and banking power, perhaps open immigration policies, and uniform standards on consumer products. Such pacts are typically less homogenous than a military alliance, but they allow state members of such to enjoy pretty powerful economic benefits. So a good IRL example would be the EU, where states have banded together to create a much more powerful economic bloc capable of challenging other superpowers or major markets, while individual ones wouldn't have been able to. Economic pacts also allow for greater specialisation of nations' economy and industry. So while one nation might be extremely good at exporting electronics, they might need to import large amounts of food and basic raw materials. In such an economic bloc with no particular tariffs between members, you could specialise this even more so that you're importing all of these things while exporting what you are specially good at, and really capitalise on taking over such a market. Helps maximise economic growth and leads to greater interconnectivity and potentially interesting developments in RP as well. You can have all of your, I guess, electronics or a particular thing built by X nation that you're in a pact with, and that sort of helps interconnectivity and building relations between players as well. But economic pacts themselves, while quite common, are often way less tangible than military alliances. So military alliances, you can kind of be like, right, we're in a military alliance now. If so-and-so invades, we all go defend each other and we all get these benefits, blah, blah, blah. Well, economic pacts, there's no real, like, straight-up tangible, haha, I'm rich now, or whatnot. So they don't have sort of, I guess, set advantages, but they work as a framework to help facilitate players working closer together, and they also provide really good backdrops for story and unusual avenues of RP, like economic ups and downs. And just sort of, it helps get you to that point where you can say, yeah, my nation has a decent economy, they're in this big economic pact, etc. So, the next one is what's sort of termed a power block around political affiliation. Now, these are extremely nebulous in comparison to military and economic blocks, and they can actually typically incorporate aspects of both. But at the end of the day, they're focused more on nations and their similarities of their politics and ideology, rather than anything else as the focus. So, for example, a group of communist nations may try to band together for their own good under the banner of a pro-communist bloc. What that bloc exactly entails, beyond mutual cooperation and greater diplomatic actions, can be extremely varied. So they could have economic aspects, it could have military aspects, or it could be just a case of trying to push that particular ideology as a sort of unified front. But as said, they're kind of extremely nebulous. So a good example of one of these IRL is Comintern, although it was also sort of rolled into other things during the Cold War, or the Quadrilateral, which is, in more modern terms, it's a political bloc formed against China, and although it is kind of too focused around joint security, there is a lot of just sort of furthering operations and cooperation, and just sort of, showing that they're ideologically opposed to China and as such will work together more closer. So in RP, these blocks are generally quite sparse, and you won't typically find them being like big separate independent entities, more like a very loose blanket umbrella that you might have, say, like, this nation is part of X power block, even though it's not really a big set in concrete thing. So, there can be anywhere from a vague affiliation to, a big politically unified sphere which acts as a larger entity, but it all comes down to context. And the last power block, which is pretty rare in RP, that I can really think of, is what I would call like a dominion. So, dominions are typically focused around a central power, be that one nation or several nations, which control virtually all of the power within that framework. The rest of its members are not there by choice, but they're vassals or protectorates or client states, which simply follow the ruling of those nations in power's wishes or commands. This could be, retooling of their economies to help prop up the controlling nations, providing tithes and resources, supplying forces to fight in wars, all sorts of things really. But, some of these vassals may have limited degrees of independence, others might be nothing but literal direct puppets. So, kind of either way there. A good example of this in real life would be various empires, especially stuff like the British Empire, with its many colonies, vassal states, etc. Most of which, independent, but if, the islands want to go and do something, then, the rest of them have to come and help. So, as said, you don't really see this type of block done in RP, and I think this is purely due to the nature of players and the fact that people don't really want to play second fiddle to another player. So you won't really see it, because obviously people kind of have egos and they don't, really like being in second place, but such blocks are pretty interesting, and especially so if they're a result from direct RP in consequence, be that conquering a large area or something happening politically. So long as everyone agrees in that situation, then, everything is pretty good. So, why do these power blocks come to power? Well, power blocks form, of course, from an endless multitude of reasons, which depend individually on, all of these different contexts, precisely what nations are involved, and a myriad of other things. So when creating your own power block or joining one that is being created, know that your situation is likely viable, and as long as you have a decent reason for it to be sort of built up, you're going to be fine. Typically, such blocks, especially in military terms, come out of either necessity or as a chance to cement control across a large area, particularly in relation to a threat or a foe to the whole group. It may cause them to work together and create a uniform alliance that have a better chance of countering it. Meanwhile, an economic bloc may come about in order to challenge the economic hegemony of a particular superpower, or it might be because a particular group of nations are in a very powerful spot economically, and they want to capitalise on a particular market or cement their own hegemony. At the end of the day, regardless of what block comes to be created, it comes down to the simple fact that nations working together for a, somewhat unified goal, depending, can often achieve far more than any singular nation of, its component parts. An example of, I guess, in this case, an economic pact that shows this off well is, take Latvia, for example. It has virtually no economic or military pull on its own compared to, say, the United States or Russia or China. And so if Latvia wanted to apply economic pressure or military pressure to any of those powers to try and get them to, say, change tariffs or solve land disputes or anything like that, well, Russia, China and the US are just going to laugh in Latvia's face. But in joining the EU or NATO, all of the other European and Western countries behind Latvia now will effectively be deterrents. And so Latvia, if it tries to push, what it wants through, has the whole backing of all of these different countries and their militaries and their economies, and so can, wield just as much power as all of them combined. So suddenly Latvia goes from being, some tiny country with not much push and pull, to a large power bloc, which has as much push and pull as the other superpowers, and so they're going to have to listen, and they're going to have to accede to whatever tariffs or land disputes, etc. So, just like IRL, these tactics work for RP and can help smaller nations compete with much, much larger ones through mutual cooperation. So, you can all work together to try and counter some of the superpowers. So, what kind of build-up do you need to effectively create these blocks? Well, just like any major project in RP, creating a new alliance or a power block requires some good setup and, some decent work. Such organizations really don't pop up overnight, and are built from a large foundation of diplomacy, mutual cooperation, and trust. Of course, this depends on the power block and the context of its formation and complexity of purpose. So, any foundation has to start with diplomacy. Any member state is kind of ideally going to be on good terms with other member states in the power block, especially ones that focus on like economic ties and military ties. Unstable or unfriendly nations are typically not going to be allowed in or considered unless the situation is really dire or desperate. For example, World War II, you got the Allies. Well, that's not technically an official entity. The West was quite happy to work with the Soviet Union purely for necessity. Situations like that, it can work, but you would never find, like NATO declining Russia's entry, during the Cold War. Right? Well, understandable, to be honest. So, you wouldn't just let that happen. So you've got to have at least understanding of the other nations in character that are going to be sort of becoming members. You're not going to have just random nations turning up and being like, oh yeah, I'm joining this like really tight-knit military alliance, because some of the others are going to be like, who the hell are you? Why would we defend you? You're random nobodies, like you're nothing to us. Of course, if you have larger, I guess, more open organizations or power blocks, it's not so much a problem. An example would be in Ancerious, the CGSS, or IRL, the UN. You can just sign up and you're part of that, and it's a multilateral organization that is going to try and do things for the betterment of everyone. Doesn't mean that you're going to agree with North Korea, for example, if you're, Germany or whatnot, but same sort of thing. Anyone can sort of turn up to these power blocks if they're like that, sign up and get in, but, not everyone has to be on your good books. So, after you've at least had some understanding between nations, or you've RP'd diplomacy between these nations, it's going to be trust building. So, there should be interactions between members before any sort of like mention of a power block, or signing of any treaties, or like officiating it, so that it looks like the member states at least trust each other and can work with each other before leaping into such like a massive thing. Again, especially if it's going to be something like a tight-knit military alliance. So, yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense if, like, random Nation 34 turns up and joins. You're going to want to have maybe an RP, even if it's just stuff like news posts or journals where they're, like, working together. If you guys don't want to, like, tediously RP that, you can just build it up over time with, like, news posts and updates. Anything to basically be like, yeah, these guys are working with each other, everything's okay, we're building towards something. You want to at least have one instance where somebody suggests making this block or organization, and then you can sort of go from there. The main development then should obviously be the creation of the block itself. It could be done as a news announcement in character, or it could be an RP where there's, lots of signing with representatives and nations bringing up concerns or amendments. While you can do this, I don't recommend it, because every one that I've seen in RP kind of bogs down into minutiae. Especially if somebody has decided to, say, write a constitution. You can do that. I don't recommend it, because it gets really tedious, and it can cause some issues a bit later on that I'll cover. but at least you want to get, if there is going to be an RP, it done and dusted. It should be really straightforward. Everyone should be cool. You know, no sudden changes at the last minute. Once created, however, and this is the main thing that I need to get across. Once your power block and alliance has been created, oh, somebody's dying outside. You want it to start acting in its own interest and that of its members. Okay? You don't want your power block to just be created and then it to just sit around doing nothing. You want to undertake RPs. You want to undertake actions to complete goals of this power block. Be that military build-up in regards to focusing down that particular threat that your military alliance went to. It could be big economic ventures, like investing into a particular player faction for them to help build a megastructure or something. Just anything to really push the agenda of your block forward on the galactic stage. Get it out there, get it doing stuff, get it noticed. Because if your block just sort of sits there, nobody will care. And everyone will forget about it. And it won't really be a big thing. So, you know, at the end of the day, as long as you have viable build-up through RPs, news articles, journals, etc., which paint a realistic and believable picture of these nations coming together and creating a power block, and then doing stuff that, you know, gets it into the limelight, everything's going to be okay. You're not going to have a problem creating these blocks. So this kind of like moves on to how to manage and run one of these power blocks. And the number one rule that I'm going to tell you, and this might not be the first thing that comes to mind, is that if you're going to run and manage a power block or an alliance RP, it is obviously to effectively communicate closely and consult with the members of your power block, okay? You don't want to be in a situation where you are inadvertently god-modding or railroading other nations. And you might be thinking like, how? So, if all of us here have joined a military alliance, okay, as an example, okay, and we sort of come up with an idea of doing a particular thing, yeah, if 5 of us out of the 9 of us here decide that actually we're not going to do that thing, we're going to do this other thing, yeah, and it doesn't really go along with what the other nations would do, and it doesn't make sense for them to do it in character either. If we start essentially putting pressure on you guys out of character and in character to do this action, even though it wouldn't make sense in character, and you do it, it's inadvertently railroading. So if you're in an alliance or a power block, you absolutely have to make sure that this sort of like, I guess, the political pressure from this block, its actions, its stories, what it's doing, is not forcing players to go down routes that they would not want to take. Now, obviously they can fight against that in character, that can breed story, but this comes back to the communicate and consult, because if we all talked about it, us 5 nations could go ahead doing the change, and the other 4 could be like, actually, no, we're not doing this. We could have all talked about it before, and that causes inter-block drama, rivalries, cool story. Awesome. But you absolutely want to avoid godmodding or railroading at all costs. And that also comes for players outside the block as well. But we'll get to that bit a little bit later. So, second of all, be open with communication, not just with the members that are, you know, in the block and the power block, but also with other RPers and the entire group at large, okay? Work with everyone to come up with cool plotline ideas, yeah? Create alliance chats and discussions, but have them out in public view, okay? So, if all 9 of us are deciding, oh yeah, we're going to do this big thing, a couple of other people might come along and be like, oh, that would be cool, could we get involved even though we're not power block members? Or, you know, just involved in some way. Everyone has fun, the power block gets its sort of reach and goals, and other people get involved. Awesome. Story's being done. That's how we want it. The last thing we want is for there to be back chats and secretive alliance chats, because that always goes badly, and I can tell you that from countless experience. The moment that happens is when you start hiding things from other people. And if you're hiding things from other people, why? What don't you want them to see? Is your alliance mysteriously going to go and invade someone? Do they know they're being invaded? If not, unfortunately you just broke some serious RP boundaries and etiquette boundaries and several rules at the same time. Are you trying to do actions behind the scenes and get them posted to the journal? Do the admins know? Do they see it? Has it been approved? Because if not, you're trying to pass things by us without our approval, and that's breaking the rules. So, and also that it can create cliques at the end of the day. If you have your own little secretive chat, you get your own clique. And cliques are devastating for RP groups and just communities as a whole, because it divides people. And the moment you start dividing people is the moment you start killing story. So always have everything in the open, be upfront with people, get that good story going. You know, remember that they exist for cooperation, rather than any sort of direct gains for particular nations or players' competitiveness. So, try to also run block-oriented plotlines and stories to get your block members on board. They could be small affairs, they could be multi-arc affairs, you know, some military blocks could even conduct joint projects. We've had that before where players design crossover ships between the different factions, or units in general. It's come up with some really cool things. People love it. Just get some stuff going for your block to do things. Don't just have everyone sort of sitting around just like, cool, we're part of an alliance. Now what? Well, what do we do? You know, always get some stuff going. And also, spend time designing a symbol or a flag for your power block or like alliance. You know, the cooler the better. Everyone always usually likes that. So that I can definitely recommend. So, how to create a block without it ruining the overall setting narrative. So, power blocks are cool, and they make sense in RP, and in real life as well. But you've got to be very careful, because while power blocks can bring a lot of things to the setting in terms of basis for large arcs and stories with many, many members, they can also really quickly ruin the setting through getting like too large or too overbearing. So what I mean by that is, if most of the members in Ancerious, say, joined one particular military alliance, and there was only a handful of people that weren't in that alliance, it really stifles the entire story, because where's the adversity? Where's the sort of, you know, players wanting sort of conflict with each other, even if it isn't just, you know, shooting or whatnot? You know, where's the tension? It's not there. And the moment that starts to happen, the moment that blocks get too big, people start thinking, well, if this RP is happening with this big event, why isn't this big block stepping in to do something about it? Oh, actually, we should do that. And then they get involved in the event, and then the event gets ruined because the power block brings in some like big peacekeeping force that starts shooting up all the bad guys, and it gets derailed. And then every single thing that happens has to go past the block scrutiny, where will we get involved, will we not? And then players are like, oh, it's not really worth it. I don't want to get gangbanged by like 15 people in one RP. And so they just shut down the RP ideas, and it just stifles everything. This is the sort of, I've seen this happen in numerous RP groups. It almost happened in Ancerious, but we circumvented it, and it's just the outcome that you really don't want to go down with power blocks. So to prevent this, the best way of really stopping big power blocks from getting too much, you know, power or influence is really simply to balance it out with another power block. You can always introduce another big group of powerful factions that are ready to contend with the existing one that's growing. This typically will always introduce some sort of conflict. It will eventually likely escalate, where both blocks, have to fight it out. They'll either cripple each other, or them fighting each other will give neutrals the power to do their own things without, worrying about everything being intervened. Or they can become critical elements for either block to try and win over during the war. Either way gives good story, and it basically puts everyone in a position of, there's a big war going on, there's lots of cool things, but it keeps in check these big blocks of factions that can just sort of do whatever they want. Another method to prevent them from getting too overbearing is kind of a bit sort of over the top, but it's to disband them, or have events that sort of discredit the block to the point where it forces its disbandment, or, perhaps causes a load of its members to leave, even if that's like a split or something. Just anything that reduces its power. Now, obviously, I'm saying this as a GM to the point where you want to do this with full player cooperation. I'm not telling you to just straight up write a fucking story piece where the power block just disbands one day and everyone's like, wait, what? What do you mean our power block disbanded? Why? Like, don't do it out of nowhere, but you want to start introducing things which will destabilise the power block. So we, Ancerious, personally did this after the Second Ancerious War, where we had the Ancerious Galactic Alliance, the AGA, running around the galaxy after the war, having won as this big sort of UN interventionist force. Now, the problem is that we wanted to have all these things happen, events, but at the same time it was kind of like, well, why wouldn't the AGA intervene in that and stop it? Or why wouldn't they do something to stop this? Or why wouldn't that faction that's in the AGA do something to stop this? And it kind of got a bit overbearing, and the AGA had kind of outlived its story usefulness, and things were already underway in some of the factions as to not really trust it. Some of the actions between the different AGA members had caused problems in the war, and this only got worse as several instances of RP happened, and it caused a rift. The main two founding members effectively left it, and then it quickly disbanded after that. Boom. Everyone was okay with it. Perfect. Problem solved. Another potential way, if you don't want to kill it or hurt it or throw it into a war, is to organise events for that particular power block. Keep them busy. Keep the members of that power block busy. Nobody is going to want to be overbearing or intervene in all of these other people's plots if they've got their own big major arcs to deal with, be that crises that are going on with some of the block members, be that a big threat that comes from somewhere else, be that an economic depression or an uprising from all of the vassals in a particular dominion, or a big ideological split in terms of, a political affiliation block. Just, give an event that's going to get everyone involved and happy to put their sort of all into it. So don't ever leave sort of power blocks. Again, don't just leave power blocks sitting there twiddling their thumbs doing anything, because it doesn't help with their standing, and it also means that their players kind of get bored and they're like, well, why are we in this? And, well, let's go do something else, They're a way to facilitate story. Please use them as such. So, next up, how to RP interplay and conflict between nations within a power block itself. So, at the end of the day, if you create a big alliance and power block, not every nation or member of that block will be on the same page. In fact, many of them may have outright conflicting interests, despite their situation. Good examples of this are Turkey within NATO, which has come to outright blows with other NATO members and has consistently tried to undermine the security of NATO to get their own way, or would be Hungary in the EU, as shown at the moment, where the EU is trying to put up a united front against Russian aggression, and Hungary is, not wanting to do that because it's trying to look out for not only itself, but it's also friendly with Russia. So, you're always going to have these dissenting voices in factions in your bloc. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't worry if people in your big alliance are disagreeing in character. That's cool. That leads to adversity. Adversity leads to good story. So, it can always lead to instances where politically adverse nations may start, denouncing each other's actions or trying to undermine one another through diplomacy, and, that requires other members in the bloc to try and mediate to prevent further escalation. It could actually lead to internal sanctions or trade disputes in economic blocs, or it could lead to military fallout in military blocs, and, depending, it could even escalate to outright combat between the two sides, either over, perhaps, in using the same Turkey IRL example, territorial claims and disputes with Greece over Cyprus, or it might be large economic concessions where, the belligerent party is like, well, we will vote to approve this particular motion, but if we're going to do so, you're going to have to pay up a bit or give us some incentives to do so. So there's lots that could be RP'd and escalated through the actions in character. If conflict, actual shooty conflict does occur in your bloc, it should never escalate to outright full open warfare. Because at that point, it pretty much can lead to the bloc expelling nations from it. And then it kind of gets a bit bloody. But, having skirmishes or specific actions, sure, no problem. Like, that can work. In the more loose blocks, like, as we talked about, like the UN or CGSS, I mean, go for it, go do whatever you want. Like, you're only a loose affiliation that's diplomatic. You're not there under any sort of, like, pretenses. It's not like Russia gives a fuck about the UN and its invasion of Ukraine, etc. So, the world's your oyster in that regard. But, don't forget that nations can attempt to undermine one another in the political field, even within their alliances, and it can lead to particular members trying to, gain control of the power block in some way, shape, or form. Even towards the end of the AGA, there were sort of, I guess, musings of power discrepancy between the Union and Khanate. Both of them were trying to, sort of get on the one-up, but at the same time, both of them didn't like the rest of the AGA and what had happened in 2AW, so they decided to band together and then form the CGSS. In Saga and Kona as well, at the moment in 3AW, you've got numerous nations trying to vie for the top. You've got Aurelia on top of Kona, but at the same time, you've got other nations that are trying to take it in a much more moderate direction, like New Jannar. In Saga, you've got people like the Union, but you've also got people like Restorationist Capital. So there's loads of story to be had. Irregardless of whether your block is having its own story arcs, you can then make huge amounts of story just from nations disagreeing or trying to undermine each other within the block. So loads of fun to be had there. How to play sort of conflict between power blocks on a larger scale. This one's kind of pretty simple, but to put it bluntly, power blocks themselves are not truly an RP entity. You don't RP a power block in the same way that you would RP your nation or a character, for example. So power blocks are kind of background factors, which they exist. You can be tied to it, you can be involved with it, but it only exists to formulate RP on a large scale. Yeah? It's kind of like how we've talked about in Ancerious, the Jobadiah report and the economic crash, or some of the coronavirus arcs that are coming later, the big disease arcs. they themselves, you don't have direct RPs for. Like, you don't directly RP in an economic crash. But they're large matters that have lots of journals and news stuff going on that give you tie-ins to put into whatever your stories were ongoing at the time, or to build arcs around that involve nations involved with them. So these big blocks are just RP facilitators, which are really good at what they do. So, you really want to be on a large scale formulating and deepening blocks, in a diplomatic sense towards, you know, each other's nations, and do that by, using news posts or journals, which can allow, the descriptions of what the block's doing and its members as a whole, officializations of different rules or regulations or votes, so that you don't have to outright RP them in really tedious minutiae, or signing treaties or whatnot. Pretty much, you can actively work out or hold a dialogue for these things. But again, it doesn't have to be done in RP. We've had lots of things go on where Saga and Kona in 3AW have been making these like big sweeping accusations to the galaxy at large and making these big declarations, but they're not like agreed upon in an RP. It's just a news post that's like, oh, they had a big gathering and decided this, and then, this short news post essentially shows you the TLDR of what actually happened. So, yeah, like, the actual block itself, you shouldn't be RPing it as an entity. Just use it as a core to any RP that you want to go around, be that wars, intrigue, plots, character interactions, etc., that can bring quite a lot of depth to them. So, yeah, like, if you're going to RP interblock conflict, you want to have a lot of these sort of big political scale journals and news posts coming out. You don't want to have just like endless block meetings all the time. You'll never RP them. We tried in 2AW, it was soul destroying. And these blocks are obviously going to generate extremely large scale, conflict, be that non-combat conflict or outright wars like 2 and 3AW. So this kind of takes us into the fun part of every discussion, which is what not to do when creating a power block, or an alliance, or an organisation for that matter. So, first off, don't create them just because you want one, or because you think that it would make your nation more powerful and competitive. If the block that you're going to create doesn't have a reason to exist, just don't create it. It's as simple as that, like, not every nation needs to be in a grand alliance or a power block or an economic pact. Just do what makes sense for your nation. Would they join one? Cool. Do they have a particular reason to make one that's not been done in a particular area? Cool. Don't use power blocks, as we sort of talked before, to lord over other players and try and control them. As we sort of stated, big power blocks can intervene in RPs because it just makes sense in character, or can sort of like railroad people. And so you don't ever want these blocks to intimidate players into not doing certain actions or storylines, just because there's the big risk that your block is going to intervene or invade them or stop them purely due to, OOC reasons, especially if you're using it to bully. And that has been done in this group before, several times actually, and each time it's been cracked down on really hard. But there has been times where particular players have used power blocks of friends, again with back chats and stuff not revealed, to bully certain players so that they couldn't carry out certain RPs that they wanted to do so. If you do that, we will easily obliterate your ass in this group, because that's probably one of the worst things you can do. If you're in a military alliance, or something to that effect, don't use your block or alliance to intercede in RPs willy-nilly and drag all of the members of such or your allies into small conflicts or small storylines at every goddamn opportunity, okay? It ruins stories and RPs, and it doesn't make sense. If there is a small border skirmish going on somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, it does not make sense for the fucking, I don't know, poo-poo military alliance with 20 active members with massive fleets to immediately jump into the system with a 10,000 ship doomstack to fight some Somali tier pirates with 10 fucking ships. I've seen it happen quite a lot in a lot of other servers, and it's happened in this one as well, where Powerblocs just kind of just go like, oh, well, there's fighting here and my nation's going to get involved because, reasons. I immediately invoke this treaty and bring like 15 other players to this RP. States, in real life, do not like getting into conflict, okay? Even if they are the strongest allies you can imagine, okay? If it's not in their interest, they don't care. Yeah? You have plenty of examples from history that we could go into. There's even modern ones, like the Gulf War, or Libya, or Syria, or any of that kind of stuff, yeah? Just because certain members of a bloc go into a certain sort of, I guess, war zone, does not mean that every other one of their allies is immediately going to jump on the bandwagon or the gravy train. Just like if you are in a defensive alliance, okay, and you're invaded, that does not mean automatically that every other one of your defensive allies who promise to defend you will get involved in that war. Yeah, they signed that piece of paper, but they're not going to throw their nation away if you've just been invaded by some giga superpower and you're all just a bunch of like small nations, because why would they sacrifice their entire nation for yours? Even if they are like brotherly allies, that would be suicide. That would, that would be awful. So you've got to be careful that if you are in these sort of military blocks, just because you are, doesn't mean that you're automatically tied to, like, get dragged into a war, or that you can drag everyone into a war willy-nilly, especially for small events. And, on the same sort of page, just because you're, say, in an economic pact, doesn't mean that you can now brag that you control the economy or that you're super duper rich and that you've got like the best of everything and that you became an economic giant overnight. That's not how that works, Everyone in the EU is in an economic pact and not every one of those is a giga economic power. So, as sort of we touched on earlier, don't think that everyone in your bloc or alliance is going to think the same way or follow the same agenda without, just questioning. They're not going to follow your orders. Conflict within blocks is everywhere, and conflict of interest or actual outright combat can happen, and it will probably happen, and I hope it does happen because it has good story. But don't just have a yes-man power block, because that doesn't make sense. That's not what happens in character. So don't just sort of have these jackbooted yes men walking around with you at all times. Don't, as we sort of, again, just said a moment ago with following treaties to the letter, don't create sort of a power block and immediately expect them to follow that power block sort of, I guess, dictates to the absolute letter and then have a go at them out of character about it. That has happened more times than I can count, virtually everywhere that I've seen, especially if they have written an actual constitution for it. And there are people who have done that. Too many, in my opinion, but it's happened quite a lot. Where somebody will go over and they'll go over the fine-tooth comb and they'll write these big constitutions that nations in this power block have signed. And then something happens and one of the nations in the power block decides not to uphold their end of the bargain. And the person who wrote it goes absolutely apeshit and starts harassing them out of character and having a go at them, like, oh, you agreed to this, blah, 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 blah. No, that's not what happens. Nations don't always agree to it in character, and just because the nation doesn't agree with it in character doesn't mean that you can be a cunt out of character. It's as simple as that. Also, don't create a power block or a pact, have it hyped up to be this big thing, and then, never do anything with it. Because, again, that's happened quite a lot. It's just like, oh, there's this new power block in, X part of the galaxy. Alright, what are they about? Oh, kind of this, I suppose. Alright, what have they done? I guess like this one little RP here. Okay, so why are they relevant? Like, why should my nation consider this big military alliance that's never actually done anything to be a threat or relevant? Like, I'm not going to care if I'm invading some dude, right, about his military alliance that he signed 3 years ago IRL in a particular RP, and half of his other, like, I guess, power block is just inactive, both out of character and in character, because it just looks like those nations just don't really care, and that it's just a piece of paper and doesn't really mean anything. If you're going to create a power block, put the time in to run it, make it big, make it a big thing, give it plot lines, and actually make it so that people go, oh yeah, that alliance, yeah, no, they're pretty big. Like, oh yeah, like, maybe I can do some stuff with them. Blah 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 blah. Have them have weight behind their names, yeah. And if at any point, you find yourself in big power blocks that are stifling RP and preventing neutral or regular players from running their plots, just don't continue. As said, take steps to rectify that. If you don't, the admins will, and will be a lot more forceful than you are. Be aware, Don't just use it to control things as you want. So, with that sort of meme section out of the way, let's get to some examples of power blocks, both in character in Ancerious and in real life. So we'll start off with Ancerious. The AGA and the APP, Ancerious Galactic Alliance, and the Ancerious Pivotal Powers. They were both hybrid military alliances and ideological affiliations, which would basically focus on countering each other. The AGA wanted galactic unity, where there was a big governing body that would intervene in any sort of conflicts, or like the inverted commas ideal UN, while the APP, the Ancerious Pivotal Powers, wanted a galaxy that was completely and utterly independent, where states had full sovereign right to do as they please, and if that meant one state completely wiped out another state, so be it. That was the way things should be. Nobody else has a right to intervene, and if they want to, there could be a war, blah, blah, blah. So, they pretty much went at each other's throats, and that was the entire plot line of Second Ancerious War. They had a little bit of economic trade agreement in there. They had mutual military defence and operations, joint projects, ideology to a degree. The APP was destroyed at the end of the war because they lost, and the Ancerious Galactic Alliance said they disbanded post-war because of the occupation of capital and the stresses of various events that went on post-war, and the results of stuff that happened in war as well. Next up, CGSS, the Coalition of Galactic Safety and Security. This is a current power block, although it's kind of more like an organisation in terms of Ancerious. It's a multilateral organisation which was created post-2AW to try and keep the peace, but it was supposed to be a forum open to all nations, and it was supposed to be a way of directing diplomacy and interaction. It doesn't really have any executive power or influence, it's just a forum for nations to talk. So it's pretty loose, everyone can be part of it no matter who they are, very open and good for sort of large storylines. For those of you who are currently active, Saga and Kona, the second Ancerious Galactic Alliance, and the coalition of native Ancerious. Pretty much, again, two large ideological blocks, primarily. Again, focused around countering each other, with Saga wanting pretty much Aurelia and the anti-colonials gone, while Kona wants to curtail the colonial advancements. They both kind of seek hegemony over the galaxy. They both incorporate extremely loose military and economic rules, but they're pretty much unwritten organisations, and anyone can sort of like join and leave at a whim. So while they're large and pretty influential, they're not really that sort of solidified. You've got the ICA, which is formed on the basis of maintaining economic stability in the Inverness corridor, and sort of serves as an economic power block at heart more than anything. But it was formed as a reactionary sort of block to the formation of ACOM. And ACOM itself is another sort of economic power block formed by the Lothlorians, with the aim of sort of maintaining a neutral, stable party in the face of 3AW. But there's a lot of sort of like control behind the scenes and client states in both of those, so that's kind of like an interesting sort of like subtle hint with Dominion going on there. For IRL, however, you have stuff like the Mutual Defence Pact of the Southeastern Provinces, which was a pact formed by warlord states during the European invasion of the Qing dynasty during the Boxer Rebellion. And they formed a collective neutral pact that essentially prevented both the Qing and the Europeans using their states as fighting grounds. And they sort of went in and tried to subdue the rebellions themselves. So, Intermarium, a collective defence pact formed, envisioned by Poland actually, to pool the collective strength of small post-World War I states that were sandwiched between Soviet Russia and Germany for, mutual defence. You had the Eight Nation Alliance, a European alliance formed between the Entente and Central Powers to jointly attack China during the Boxer Rebellion, which went in to obviously take it out. You got the European Coal and Steel Community, which is a multilateral trading association between Western European states to facilitate trading of select goods to specific standards as well. You've got the NAFTA, which is, Americans should be quite aware of this. There was a big thing about it a fair few years ago, which is a multilateral free trading agreement to remove barriers of commerce between North America and, various member states. You've got the British Protectorates, which is a hegemonic system in which numerous countries surrendered control of their foreign policy to the collective policy making of the British Empire in exchange for defence and internal independence. And my European friends will know Interpol, which is an international organisation ratified by hundreds of countries, not just European either, to prosecute international criminals so that they can't use borders to escape the jurisdiction of a country charging them. So, as shown, you got all sorts of ways to doing, power blocks. They don't have to be focused around specific things. They can be loose, they can be all about cross-border stuff, and really you can go any direction you want. So, that kind of solidifies what I have written down. So I guess, if anyone has any questions or wants to add anything, we've already got some questions in chat, so I'll sort of answer that now. Can power blocks be done with NPCs rather than players? And if so, does this change how you approach it at all? Absolutely, they can be used with NPCs. ACOM and ICA, which belongs to him and GigaChad respectively, have quite a lot of NPCs within their power blocks. Doesn't change how they RP them. Saga and Kona also have absolutely metric fuck tons of NPCs in their sort of nation. In fact, that's kind of the focus of the arc, is around NPCs. So at the end of the day, as long as you're kind of showing that there's NPC involvement here and there, be that through journals or news agencies, you're going to be fine. Again, the block is just there to facilitate RP. If you want to use some of the NPCs for that, all good. Are there or have there been any more shadowy power blocks, be that with negative or positive intentions or examples? That's a good question. I can't think of any in Ancerious, but I don't see why not. I mean, there's no reason that power blocks have to be public. They can be behind the scenes, fighting things that maybe don't want to come to light. So in Ancerious, actually, well, it's not so much, I would say, an official power block, but yeah, like the Unnamed, the Tranatonians, and the Naiath are sort of like all working together, sort of with their own goals in mind, but they're all sort of working to keep the galaxy and help it into 3AW to keep it all like chaotic, so it's easier for them to carry out their goals. So I guess that would count. Would it be wise to have multiple player nations of the same player in one power block? Yes and no. So ideally, you don't want player nations of the same player working in the same power block for the same goal, because then it can be hard to tell conflict of interests, or whether that you're using both of those nations sort of to further one another, if that makes sense, to like have them get a leg up. But at the same time, yes, because it can happen. I played 3 of my nations together in 2AW that were on the APP side, and they worked closely. Well, 2 of them worked closely with one another, and It worked well for the story, and it put the story first, and they both basically got fucked at the outcome. For 3AW, we've got players who have like multiple nations on one side. Um, so yeah, like ideally, no, but it completely depends on context. Like, you know, if you could usually tell if a player is trying to have like multiple of their own nations on one side for their own game, rather than like they're just purely in it because that's what that nation would do, sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, as sort of said, like, my two nations, the Union and Capital, are both in Saga. That doesn't mean they're on the same side, even though they are on the same side. Capital is absolutely out to fucking get the Union, and the Union is trying to do everything it can so that Saga's actions do not benefit Capital. So yeah, it's sort of that case of yes, they're on the same side, but no, they're really not friends. Would technology sharing be a potential basis for a power block? I wouldn't say purely technological sharing, but I would say scientific endeavour would be a decent foundation for a power block, which can then incorporate, technology sharing. Yeah, yeah. I would say that on that sort of topic and similar, you've got to look at it from the perspective of like, what is this power block or organization going to bring to terms with like role play for your nation and other members? Now, you might want to do like a waste collection power block that's sort of like an organization spanning all these nations, but that's kind of something that you just put an entry into the unaligned list for, and it's like, this exists, these people are in it, this is what it does. Boom, that's it. Like, that's all it needs for the setting, like, there's not ever going to be some like news reports about waste collection or RPs about waste collection. It's just going to be like, this is a background thing, it exists. Meanwhile, like, a big scientific power block may start out as just an unaligned entry, but people might start doing RPs with it to the point where it's like actively looking into, say, a galactic problem to do with viruses, or like, there's ways that you can take those things and, I guess, make them relevant to the story and use them for the catalyst and RP, but it's all how it should be done. Yeah, Yeah, just have a look at it. Yeah. Anyone else have any other questions or anything to say, or is that it? Oh, you have something. All right, hold on. Oh, go on. Yeah, go on. That's why that you find most sci-fi settings in a lot of games and the like. Some of their, I guess, factions can kind of be power blocks in regards to different nations under one banner or organization, and big power blocks that you can sort of become part of provide a really easy, I guess, springboard into the setting for people to then learn about, like, why are these power blocks fighting each other? Who's in these power blocks? Why are they in this situation? What brought them to this point? Sort of, you know. So yeah, it's good for context, and they definitely help in that regard. Blue. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like, that's happened plenty of times IRL. And yeah, you can definitely get that sort of thing occurring, and I pretty much imagine that something like that is going to happen in 3AW with regards to Saga and Kona. For example, let's take Kona. You've got the extreme hardliners with Aurelia that want, you know, Colonials gone, but then you also have more moderates with New Jannar who basically just want to be like, yo, all we want to do is just impose some sort of rules on the colonials so that, you know, they're not completely just steamrolling our economies and everything every 5 seconds. So, you know, as long as that happens, we're cool, war's over, we can go back to what we're doing. But then it really is there like, no, death to the colonials, get rid of them all, and that's going to lead to, you know, massive internal disagreements and power blocks within power blocks. You know, New Jannar has already put forward a sort of economic pact within Kona that focuses on assisting natives economically, and so they're already sort of laying the groundwork for a more moderate Kona that is going to be self-supporting and independent of the colonials, to the point where, like, oh, well, you know, if we're more dependent on each other rather than the colonials, we don't have to worry about them fucking stuff up all the time. So, you know, we don't really need to be fighting this war, and we don't really need to get rid of them. So, absolutely, power blocks within power blocks. Of course, it obviously depends on size. If there's a power block with like 3 of you, and like one of you decides to make his own internal power block, like, yeah, it doesn't really work, but for obvious reasons, you know. But yes, power blocks within power blocks are fun, and that sort of aids into the whole story and adversity and conflict in your own power block. Yes, but it basically gets to the point. If it gets to that point, that the power block essentially tears itself apart, and the problem fixes itself. Yeah. 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 What you would probably have to do is obviously you'd be playing some sort of like federation or loose confederation of states. You would split up all of your like ship cap, system cap, etc., between all of them, however you want, and I guess you would basically have to write uh, your nation sheet from a top down perspective. So you'd be like, this is kind of what the block is like. It's made up of these nations. This is kind of what its overall goal is. These are what the individual nations are like. So it'd be a lot of work, in my opinion, but it would also be quite rewarding because you get to play effectively multiple nations in one. Um, but again, you'd kind of be like playing with yourself. You would have loads of internal plot lines that you could do, but you would have to be very good at tying them into lots of other players and RPs. Otherwise, yeah, it's like you would put in all of that effort for not much reward. But if you can pull that off, um, you know, you're fantastic, and you could probably get away with that. Any other sort of questions or anything? Were you going to say something, Blue? Yeah, I think we pretty much covered everything, to be honest. Yeah, cool. In that case, then, we shall wrap it up here tonight. And thank you all for coming.